Termo to Madeline, audio edition. Page 262, chapter titled, The Changing Town of Medellin. For 15 years after it first came on the map, Medellin grew and changed rapidly. People came and went, businesses came and went, and money did the same. Town lots and buildings changed hands rapidly. The entire town was even sold at one time. At another time, there were 19 residents in Medellin, and that did not include those in the hotel or the livery barn. The following are some of the changes that occurred in the Medellin just prior to and in the early part of the Homestead era. Since the hotel was the first building in Medellin, it provides a good starting point for our narrative. There was so much traffic through Medellin that an addition was built onto it in order to provide more storage space in the summer of 1904. The Russells, they left that same year, having run the hotel for over 2 years. Charles Sparger left the livery stable and began running the hotel when they left. He had a new appealing building to move into, as Ike Metcalf had just given it a new addition, a coat of paint. The hotel stood out for miles around in the new coat of butter and white. Charlie Sparger ran the hotel for the next 4 years. In the spring of 1908, Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Rice and their daughter moved up to Madeline and began helping with the management. That fall, they leased it from Van Loan and Sparger. In the summer of 1909, the hotel sold to J. Noble Jones, and Van Loan and Sparger retired from the hotel business. As soon as the Rice's lease ran out, Mr. Jones sold the hotel to James H. Price in December of 1909. Mr. Price was a widower, but had a couple of sons, Arthur and Van, who stayed with him. He kept the hotel until after the end of the Homestead boom, although he leased it out or hired various managers a number of times. He came to Madeline from San Joaquin. One of the earliest employees at the hotel and the NCO warehouse, Newell Hall, left Madeline with his family in 1904. Billy Jensen was the bartender in those early years. He left Madeline in 1908 and was replaced by Brock Aker. Ralph Rice was one of the early clerks in the hotel. At the NCO warehouse, business was always a-booming. Hill and Nora Long and their family came to Madeline in 1904 to replace Mr. Hall in the warehouse. Mr. Long managed the warehouse over the next several years, as well as managing the mountains of freight shipped by D.W. Earl and Company, a mail-order outfit. Now, working with Mr. Long for this company at various times were Ross Maurer and Fred Kingsbury, father of Barney and Eva Kingsbury. Working for the NCO with Mr. Long in the warehouse was Dolph Van Loen and Clarence Whittinger. Even after the railhead was removed from Madeline, the livery stable continued to be a bustling business. Freight and stages continued to go out by the horse and mule team to the west. By the time the big influx of homesteaders, Ross Maurer was leasing the Van Loan place. He kept the livery stables supplied with hay and grain. Charlie Sparger continued to manage them with the help of various local young men. Dr. Day, a veterinarian, was in Madeline for about a year in 1911. He built a house on the west side of town next to the schoolhouse. When he left, he sold his house to Frank and Beulah Campbell, homesteaders in the Brockman area. Mrs. Campbell lived there and operated it as a boarding house. Later it was sold to Mr. and Mrs. W. Pope. She and their children, Elliot and Margaret, lived there, and she also operated a boarding house. The railroad house, the workers, and the section house across the tracks north of the hotel. Besides the Gandy dancers, there were always a railroad agent to take care of passengers and mail at the depot. These gentlemen usually rented a room at the hotel. The first NCO agent was Henry Cutchum. He was followed by Bill Jensen and C.H. Smith. Eventually, of course, Harvey and Laura Fitz took over as agents for the NCO. In 1909, the railroad built a new engine house and elevated track. Oil tankers were placed on this elevated track to fill the tenders of the engines below, now that the NCO was operating solely oil burners. From its very beginning, Madeline always had at least one store and often two. Bob and Della Brasher built and operated the first one. Bob built his house before the store, and it housed the first Madeline post office. When this store was complete, he moved the post office into it, where it was to stay for several years. Before the Brasher store was ever completed, plans were in the making for another store. It was completed in the summer of 1903 and was owned and operated by Henry and Stella Bowskill. He was Madeline's first barber and made a little money on the side cutting hair. The Bowskills were only in Madeline for a year. When they left in November of 1904, Bob Brasher bought their property and became Madeline's monopolist in merchant trading. Madeline had to do without a barber from that time until the arrival of Cliff McCarter in 1912. Now, Bob Brasher continued to run Madeline General Store until 1910, when he sold out to John L. Berkey. Mr. Berkey and his wife Lula and daughter Gladys moved to Madeline at the time and operated the store until all the homesteaders packed up and left the country. When that happened, J. L. Berkey packed up and moved to Davis Creek. Madeline was not left without a general store at that time, since two stores had been operating in town since about 1913. Soon after the Fritz family came to Madeline, they built a corrugated iron building southwest of the hotel and opened up a general store, thus ending the monopoly that Mr. Brasher and Mr. Berkeley had enjoyed. Madeline even had a doctor during the homestead days. Dr. Carl Smith, his wife Cornelia, and their son Roscoe lived in a house on the west side of town. Dr. Smith had come to Madeline for health reasons, having a need to live in a high, dry climate. He had an office in his house and built up quite an extensive practice. He cared for the sick and delivered most all the babies that were born in those years from Termo to Madeline. He even went as far as Red Rock to deliver babies. Now, Mrs. Smith was a school teacher and taught at Madeline for a couple of years. Now, since Elmer Van Loan had supplied the lumber and often hired the labor for the buildings of most of the houses in Madeline, he was the owner of virtually the entire town. In 1909, he subdivided the remainder of the original 120-acre Morton tract just west of the original town site that was mapped in 1902. Then he sold Madeline in its entirety to J. Noble Jones on June 25, 1909, for $7,500. The only thing that did not transfer to Mr. Jones' ownership was the NCO right-of-way. The lot and house where Elmer Van Loan lived in the summer, and the lot and house belonging to Old McCabe. Over the next several years, people rented their houses and lots from the irrigation company. As the company went broke, various people obtained the various houses for one consideration or another. That same year of 1909, J. Noble Jones bought the homestead parcel of 40 acres from Mona Williams, bordering the Morton tract on the north of its east end. He subdivided it immediately and created the first addition to Madeline, north of the irrigation canal on the hill. Needless to say, the original town site never filled up, let alone the two new additions. Next chapter, titled Telephones. The Madeline Plains was first connected to the outside world by the NCO telegraph line that started operation in June of 1900. In 1902, when the rails moved on, the telegraph did also. By May of that year, it was completed as far as likely, connecting the plains with the huge outside world in both directions. That same spring of 1902, the first telephone line to be completed on the Madeline Plains was constructed by John Williams and Wilson Bailey, connecting their respective places through the new town of Madeline. The following spring of 1903, Willis Brockman ran a line from his place to Elmer Van Loan's. With the telegraph system at Madeline and Van Loan Station, it became possible for Williams, Van Loan, Bailey, and Brockman to communicate with each other. If Williams wanted to get a message through to John Williams, he called up Van Loan's. Somebody there would transfer the message to the NCO agent at Madeline via the telegraph line. The agent was on the William Bailey telephone line too, so he would then call up Mr. Williams and give him the third-hand message. Almost 4 years later, in the winter of 1905-1906, when they could not be doing anything else, John William put a crew of men to work cutting and distributing poles between his place and Ash Valley. The line was up and completed in March. There was already a line connecting the Ash Valley ranches with Hayden. At that point were lines connecting them with Hayden Hill and Beaver. Thus Madeline was connected by telephone with all these places and ranches. In the fall of 1906, Abe Triplett ran a line from his place to Bailey's. Elmer Van Loan and Ross Maurer ran a line from the Van Loan place over the hill to Triplett's. This bypassed the telegraph entirely, connecting all the ranchers on the Madeline end of the plains, with the exception of the Pinos. It was not until the summer of 1908 that Elgin Pino ran a line from their place down into Madeline. With the ushering in of the Homestead era, the settlers on the Madeline Plains and in Dry Valley started installing telephones in earnest. In 1907, Dry Valley and Madeline Telephone Company was established, with David S. Mitchell of Dry Valley as its president. John S. Warren, also of Dry Valley, was secretary of the company, and John Swain of Baylor Creek was the inspector. Subscribers were required to own 1 share of stock and were expected to help in construction in order to have a line run to their home and a phone installed. 1 share cost $25. Between the year of 1907 and 1916, virtually everyone on the west side of the Madeline Plains and several families in the Juniper Ridge Red Rock area subscribed to the system. Actually, the line took in some of Grasshopper Valley, too. James and Josie Fay, Gus and Rachel McCary, and John and Edith York of Grasshopper were all on the line. Then it went into Dry Valley, picking up Barney and Basley Felgham, Josie Warren, Andy Arnott, Sarah Gunn, Dave Mitchell, Charles Marlett, Lois Whittinger, Levy Metcalf, and Antone Oliver. Crossing through the gap into the plains, the line ran along the west side, picking up Bill Moody, Ike Metcalf, Eugene Rooney, Stephen Ansel, Curly Lavelle, Ben Sakari, Matt Halpine, Paul Cook, Jack Powers, Bill Strader, George Philman, Wes Philman, Roscoe Philman, Grover and Earl Smith, Clarence Whittinger, Sam Whittinger, Walter Rogers, Lige Cadell, Daddy Fraser, Brock Aker, and John Williams. Now another line went across the flat from the west side connecting into the system. Marvin Heights, Ed Hitz, Clint Olch, Frederick Webb, Wilson Brockman, and a whole list of names on page 278. All right, now at Dry Valley Gap, there was another branch that went to the Swain Ranch. Bunch of names. From there, the line went over the hill to 8 or 9 families at Red Rock. Everyone had a crank telephone with a certain combination of long and short rings as their numbers. The entire system was one big party line. This was, of course, an aid during emergencies or whenever a party or dance was to be called. No matter what ring came over the line, most everyone listened in to learn what was happening with their neighbors. All right, next chapter, titled The Mcdonald Peak Orchestra. It's going to be on page 279.